Celtic and Rangers, green and blue, the two most dominant clubs in Scottish football that have won more than 100 league titles between the two of them across the over 130 years of their shared existence. Hey, I'm Adrian and welcome to Rabona TV's Roots of the Rivalry. Now, since I started doing this series, the number one rivalry that people have requested I cover has without a doubt been the Old Firm. So, it's high time we get to it, and if there's any interest in our other derbies that we've covered, El Clasico, the Milan Derby, Merseyside, etc., then I'll link to our Roots of the Rivalry playlist in the comments. Alright, let's get to it, starting with the foundational history of both Rangers and Celtic, the initial fracture in the relationship of the two sets of supporters, and any other factors that seem to be at the heart of the insane rivalry between these two Glasgow clubs. Now remember, this isn't an entire history of each of the clubs, so I won't emphasize the Lisbon Lions, for example, or the liquidation of Rangers too much, besides, in the latter's case, how Celtic fans reacted to the news. This is strictly focusing on the founding of each club and the relationship they share, not so much individual achievements or pieces of their history that are outside of the rivalry. Cool? Alright, let's get started with the name itself. Old Firm. The origins of the name aren't 100% clear, though the book The Old Firm, Sectarianism in Sport and Society in Scotland, speculates that it could derive from the first meeting of the clubs being referred to as, quote, like two old, firm friends, end quote. Speaking of which, let's start with the first of the two teams to be founded, Rangers Football Club. In February of 1872, Peter McNeill, his brother Moses, Peter Campbell, and William McBeath met in what is present-day Kelvin Grove Park to create their own football team. They organized their first match against Callander FC, but they needed both a name and some players. Rangers was selected as their club name, borrowing the title from an English rugby side, while the rest of their squad was made up of guests, as Rangers official history puts it, players they borrowed from other clubs. Later that year, they played against Clyde and won 11-0. Not bad, and this was the first time that Rangers were seen wearing their blue kits as well. Despite the fact that you'll find Rangers Football Club's beginnings back in 1872, they officially became a functioning club in 1873, where their first annual club meeting took place. Staff members were elected, training sessions were scheduled, etc. Rangers would continue to grow from here, building up support that was largely drawn, in the early days at least, from the Protestant community in Glasgow. In fact, the club itself later had an unwritten rule, much later, that they wouldn't sign a player unless they were Protestant, with Graham Souness eventually changing things in 1989. In fact, this is probably a good place to pause and take a look at their rival Celtic and how they came to be. A good 15 years after Rangers were formed, an Irish immigrant named Andrew Cairns, more commonly known as Brother Walfrid, called for a meeting at St. Mary's Church in East Glasgow in 1887. The purpose of the meeting was to form a football club in order to raise funds for the Irish immigrant families that were living in East Glasgow. Glasgow Hibernia and Emerald Harps were considered for names, but Brother Walfrid finally settled on Glasgow Celtic in order to have the representation of the Irish in Glasgow directly in the name of the club. Celtic had a rapid rise in popularity due to the influx of Irish immigrants to Scotland in the 1800s. We'll get to that, and it's important soon. But first, on May 28, 1888, Celtic played their first ever match, and wouldn't you know it, their opponent was another local side, Glasgow Rangers. Celtic allegedly borrowed players from Hibernian to fill out their squad, and in the first ever Old Firm derby, came out on top as 5-2 winners. 2 years later, both Rangers and Celtic were founding members of the Scottish Football League, which rolled out for the 1890-91 season. After 18 matches, Celtic finished in third, while Rangers and Dumbarton were tied on points. Thus, they shared their first ever Scottish Football League title, which was their first of a Scottish record of 54 league championships. That's First Division championships, by the way, as they of course won the 4th, 3rd, and 2nd Division consecutively as well from 2013 to 2016. But after Rangers had shared the inaugural Scottish Football League title, a couple of seasons later, Celtic won their first ever league title, the first of 49, in the 1892-93 season. Their success changed them from a charitable organization into a money-making company in 1897. From there, Rangers and Celtic battled back and forth not only for supremacy within Glasgow, but Scottish football as well. Their rivalry within sport was only intensified and rooted in immigration from Ireland, sectarianism, and national identity amongst their supporters. So, now that we know a bit about the founding of each club, let's get to the heart of why these two teams hate each other so much, and why their rivalry is considered one of, if not the biggest in the world. And remember, when I start to speak of the identity of the two sets of supporters here, this is in a historical context. They may not be true representations of the fan bases as they are today, but they certainly were at one time, even as recently as the 1990s. Rangers fans are often seen as native Scotsmen, a sentiment that their fans will regularly remind their crosstown rivals of. As mentioned earlier, their fan base was largely drawn from the Protestant community within Glasgow. In the 19th century, a massive influx of Irish immigrants moved to Glasgow, more on that later, while many Protestants from the rest of Britain also flocked to Glasgow for jobs in the burgeoning shipping industry of the port city. Scotland was actually first Roman Catholic, dating as far back as the 5th century, but after the Scottish Reformations, the country adopted Presbyterianism, a sect of Protestantism, and it was solidified as a state-supported religion in 1707 once Scotland was unified with Britain. In the 19th century, with many Protestants flooding to Scotland and joining the ranks of the Rangers supporters, whom were typically British Union loyalists and Protestants, the sudden influx of Irish Catholics to the east end of Glasgow didn't sit too well with them, and led to a segregated city. But why did all of these Irish families emigrate to Glasgow in the first place? Well, the Irish had begun crossing the Irish Sea yearly for seasonal farming work in Scotland as early as the 1820s. However, once the Great Famine struck Ireland, it spurred on a massive exodus of Irish immigrants to Glasgow, Dundee, Motherwell, and other communities across Scotland. It wasn't that the Scottish didn't want any Irish in their country. The Irish Protestants, for example, had an easier ride settling in their new home. It was that they didn't want Catholics, the enemies of the Protestants. This influx of immigrants led to competition for jobs and housing in Glasgow, and it was even easier for the Protestants to hate these so-called foreign invaders when they were taking jobs and housing away from the true natives of Glasgow and the people of the Kingdom of Great Britain. Of course, these days, Glasgow isn't so much sectarian HQ, with about 60% of citizens claiming that they don't belong to any religion, or at least they aren't active within one. But there still is a lot of imagery from what happened all those years ago with the Irish coming to Scotland, and it still stands as perhaps not the base of the rivalry for modern fans, but at least what had shaped what the rivalry is to this day. For many fans, they see the differing factor not being a question of religion, but a question of nationality or national identity. If you're a Celtic supporter, then you're Irish and possibly a supporter of the IRA, or at least sing some IRA songs from time to time. And if you're a Rangers supporter, you're British Scottish. There are two sets of supporter groups in particular that truly escalated the rivalry between the Rangers and Celtic Ultras, or as they're known as in Scotland, Casuals. For Rangers, they had the Intercity Firm, or the ICF, while Celtic had the Celtic Soccer Crew. Two of their most notorious former leaders were Sandy Chugg for ICF and John O'Kane of the Celtic Soccer Crew. Meetings between these two rival casuals were particularly violent. Stabbings, ruthless beatings, hell, John O'Kane even claims in an interview with Vice that one of the crew members was thrown off a bridge near Ibrox Stadium. Some vocal minorities from both sides have been guilty of discriminatory or derogatory chants and banners aimed at their rivals. For Rangers, they often bring up Catholicism, the Pope, the Irish roots, and therefore lack of Scottish identity amongst Celtic fans, calling them Fenians, etc. Whereas Celtic fans sing IRA songs, which, as you know, is provocative, songs about the Brits and the monarchy, call the Rangers fans Huns, etc. For example, when it was announced that Rangers were being sent down to the 4th Division of Scottish football due to unpaid taxes, many Celtic fans thought of jelly and ice cream. Where does this come from? Well, Celtic fans used to sing songs about having a party when Thatcher dies. Thatcher, of course, being Margaret Thatcher, the British Prime Minister of which the IRA, the Irish Republican Army, attempted to murder in 1984. That then changed to jelly and ice cream when Thatcher dies, then to jelly and ice cream when Rangers die. So, with them being sent down, jelly and ice cream could be seen and heard fairly frequently amongst Celtic supporters and in Glasgow in general. It started as an anti-UK/Thatcher chant and now is mostly directed solely at Rangers Football Club. The Old Firm derby is as pure of a local rivalry that you'll find in football. Their divisive origins stem not only from a sporting point of view in the quest for dominance, but from a storied sectarian divide in Britain that had a microcosm within Glasgow itself. That translates to one team claiming to be the true Scotsman, while another embraces its foreign roots. Perhaps the best representation of such being the fact that neither team will fly the flag of Scotland as frequently as Celtic fans can be seen waving the Irish tricolour, while the unionist culture of Rangers fans is exhibited by the flying of the Union Jack. Even with Rangers going missing from the top flight for a few seasons, the rivalry never disappeared, nor will it ever, despite the sectarian divide fading in recent years and the rise in Catholic and Protestant marriages in Scotland acting as a representation of the blurring lines between the two sets of supporters. While friendships amongst rival supporters were rare in the past, they have increased in recent times, but that means nothing on Derby Day, as the Old Firm will continue to be one of the most explosive rivalries not only in Britain, but in world football. So there you have it. I hope that this quick look at the shared history of these two clubs and these two cultures will be helpful in your understanding of the Old Firm and why it means so much not only to the two sets of supporters, but perhaps for football fans in general. If you enjoyed this video, then as I said, there are more Roots of the Rivalry videos in the comments below. And we also produce player bios, timely news and opinion videos, explainers, and much more. I'm Adrian, thanks for watching, and I'll hopefully see you in the next one. Enjoy the derby!